We're still in the scheme of redemption. Last week, we finished up with Abraham, and we talked about the three promises that were given to Abraham and how in a lot of times in different scheme of redemption studies, they kind of get to the promises of Abraham, and then they jump right to where those promises are fulfilled. There's nothing wrong with that. That's great. However, I'd like to kind of finish Genesis because there's a pattern that we see Adam committed, and then also Noah committed, and also Abraham committed, and we're going to see this same pattern continue through the rest of the other patriarchs. And so we talked about how the problem of sin began in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, Genesis 3:6, and the solution to sin was given in Genesis 3:15. That was the first gospel sermon, not under the new covenant, but in the old covenant. And it was promising the seed of woman that would have enmity with the seed of the serpent. And so that seed from Genesis 3:15 becomes the seed of Genesis 12 through Abraham. And we're going to see that that seed continues through Abraham's line as we pick up with Isaac this morning. Before we jump into it, were there any lingering thoughts or anything about Abraham or things that we didn't cover that somebody wanted to bring up before we go past him? I guess I just covered it perfectly. There's no questions. No, I'm just totally joking. Okay, well, let's go to Isaac. Let's talk about some of these other patriarchs here. In Genesis 25 through 27, that really covers the major portions of Isaac's life. Isaac is married to Rebekah. They have twins named Jacob and Esau. And if you think about how we talked about this last week in Genesis 22, Abraham was going to offer Isaac his son as the sacrifice. And God said, stop. And God told Abraham, I know that you fear me because you have not withheld your son, your only son from me. And he provided a substitutionary sacrifice. We're not explicitly told if it was only Abraham who heard that or not. So imagine if you're Isaac and you're bound and you have some level of strength. You're not a tiny, tiny kid because you're the one who carried the wood. And imagine if you heard that and the promises were repeated to Abraham there. If you heard that, I mean, that would be a big deal. And what makes it an even bigger deal, if he heard that or not, is look at chapter 26 with me, please, Genesis 26, and we're going to look at verses 2 through 5. We don't know if Isaac heard what God said to Abraham at this point. We know there's other times where, take Paul, for example, in the New Testament, when Jesus is speaking to him, the others heard thunder, a sound as of thunder, and maybe they didn't hear the explicit words, but regardless, Isaac is given the covenant here in Genesis 26. Look at verses 2 through 5, please. Genesis 26, 2 through 5. The Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So again, we don't know if Isaac heard it in Genesis 12, but imagine how big of a deal this would be to Isaac if he did hear it. You know, he's bound, and Abraham had this tremendous faith, was going to offer him as a sacrifice, and God stays his hand, repeats his covenant with Abraham, and now God is explicitly and specifically telling you, you are going to continue this, and it's going to be in your seed. So I don't know. If I'm Isaac, I just think that's a really big deal. And we also see some things that happened here where Hagar is sent away and Ishmael is sent away in the next chapter, and things like that. But or that was a little bit before, but Isaac knows for sure that he is, yes, sir? Who is what? 26 verse 2, the Lord. That's Yahweh, the Lord. Do what? Yes, God. Okay. We'll hold on to that because we might get to that with Jacob. That's a great question. I love that. With Jacob in a couple of chapters, I'm going to try not, I get excited sometimes. I want to skip to things. I don't want to skip over stuff, but we're going to get to that too. That's great. And also when the Lord appeared to Abraham before destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, it says the Lord appeared to Abraham, and there were 3 angels too. So there's another instance where the Lord appeared to Abraham. So it's like, okay, how did he, in what form, in what manner did he do that? So we'll get there, I think, when we get to Jacob. And there's some that we're not going to notice, but there's a lot of those. I love that you asked that question. Okay, so the seed that was promised in Genesis 3:15, that is given to Abraham, Genesis 12, is now going to be the seed of Isaac here in Genesis 26. And so what's crazy about the pattern that I think we should notice here in Genesis is right after the covenant was given to Noah, what did he do? He planted a vineyard, he got drunk, and his nakedness was exposed to his son. And we saw that the problem of sin was not solved in Noah. He needed redemption just like everybody else. When Abraham is given the covenant, what does he do? He goes down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. God had told him, go to the land I'm going to show you. God never tells him, go down to Egypt because there's a famine. But Abraham goes to Egypt because there's a famine, and he lies to the Pharaoh about Sarai at that point being his sister, which technically, yes, she's his half sister, and that's whatever, but it's deception. And the Pharaoh, a pagan ruler, rebukes him. And then later, Abraham has faith, and he calls on the name of the Lord, builds an altar to God. God repeats that covenant, and then what does he do? He lies to Abimelech that Sarah is his sister. And again, technically, yes, but he was deceiving them. So the solution to sin wasn't Abraham. It was going to come through his seed. He needed redemption just like anybody else. And now with his son Isaac, he has just been given the covenant specifically and explicitly by God. And what does he do right after this? In Genesis 26, what we see is just like Noah, just like Abraham, right after God makes his promises to them, the problem of sin rears its ugly head here. Isaac lies that Rebekah is his sister to Abimelech, which that's exactly what his dad did. And it's possible that this is the same guy, Abimelech, because that's the second guy that Abraham did it to, or it could be one of his sons, but it's Abimelech, and Abimelech rebukes him here. We see a pagan ruler who's not one of God's special people here, and he rebukes Isaac. So Isaac isn't the solution either. In this whole scheme of redemption and the seed that's going to come through their descendants, they're not the solution. They need redemption just like anybody else. Isaac follows that same kind of pattern. And Abimelech, somebody who is from Gerar in verse 26, let's see. Let's see. Yeah, but Abimelech rebukes him, and it's the same problem that Abraham had. So Isaac is not the solution. Any comments or thoughts on Isaac? Okay. Well, let's move on a little bit to Jacob here. So in Genesis 27 through 35, so a much bigger chunk of text here is focused on the life of Jacob. God had already told Rebekah that the younger son was going to serve the older back in Genesis 25. Jacob literally means the one who grabs the heel, kind of like a backbiter, someone who trips somebody up, deceiver. And that's definitely an apt name for Jacob's life. Rebekah loved Jacob more than Esau, and Jacob loved Esau more than Jacob. They had favorites, and that had all kinds of issues. Jacob swindled from Esau the birthright at the end of Genesis 25 for some stew, and some Esau was really stewing about it afterward. I mean, he was really mad. I appreciate that, by the way. I saw some chuckles. Was stewing about it. But then we see that Rebekah, instead of waiting on the timing of God, she was told directly that the younger would serve the older. Instead of waiting for the timing of God, she kind of takes it into her own hands in Genesis 27. And she wants Jacob to give the younger one, Isaac to give the younger one, Jacob, the blessing. And so they have that whole deception with the goat skin and, go tell Esau to go get some meat. Isaac blesses Jacob instead. And Esau finds out about it. He's still stewing about the stew. He's even more mad because he's stolen his birthright. And so he's going to kill Jacob. So Rebekah sends Jacob away. But before Jacob leaves, I think it's important we notice Genesis 28. Genesis 28, and let's look at the first 4 verses. Genesis 28, the first 4 verses. So before Jacob leaves, Isaac has something to say to him. He knows that although he blessed the younger one, when he intended to bless Esau, that blessing meant something. And so in Genesis 28, let's look at the first 4 verses. So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and from there take to yourself a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply, that you may become a company of peoples." Look at verse 4. "May he also give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your descendants after you, that you may possess the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham." So Isaac is tricked into blessing Jacob, and Esau is tricked into giving Jacob the birthright, and Isaac knows that that means something because Isaac has had the covenant told to him specifically through his seed, and he knows, okay, I blessed Jacob. I didn't bless Esau in this way. And so he knows that the blessing of Abraham is being passed on to Jacob here. So even in this, we see the seed from Genesis 3:15 is the seed of Abraham in Genesis 12, is the seed of Isaac in Genesis 26, and now it's the seed of Jacob in Genesis 28. But God specifically is going to give this a little bit more later. And we see in Hebrews 11 and verse 20, I'll read this really quickly. Hebrews 11 and looking over at verse 20, where it says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. Even regarding things to come. So Isaac knew about the blessing that God had given him and what that was going to do, future fold, but he blessed both Jacob and Esau. And it seems here in chapter 28 of Genesis that he knew this was going to be passed on through Jacob and not through Esau. Okay, so any thoughts so far as we're in Jacob or anything about Isaac? Okay. All right, so let's look at this fascinating account. Genesis chapter 28, hope you're there already. Jacob is headed toward Haran, and as he's on the way, he comes to a certain place, and this is that story that you are probably familiar with. He uses a rock as a pillow, and he has a dream there. And look in Genesis 28, and let's look at verse 12 starting, please. Verse 12. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. He called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of that city had been Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. So Jacob has this dream, and it's really a stellar dream. And God makes it really clear, though. We'll talk about the angels ascending and descending in just a moment, but God makes it really clear in repeating this covenant that he had given to Abraham. I mean, it's almost word for word. This is the covenant that God gave to Abraham, passed on to Isaac, and now it's to Jacob. He makes it very clear. The seed from Genesis 3:15 is now being passed through the line of Jacob. And so what's crazy is in this dream, he has this dream where there's a ladder that's set on the earth. Its top is reaching to heaven. You see angels that are ascending, so they're going from the earth to heaven, and they're also descending. So they're going from heaven to the earth. And then the Lord is up there, and that's where he repeats this covenant to him. Just a really fascinating thing. And when Jacob wakes up, he says, okay, the Lord is in this place, and I didn't even know it. And he thought this was a special place. He was afraid. I love verse 17. He says, how awesome is this place? It's kind of like the question we talked about last Sunday. Who can stand before the Lord, this holy God? He was saying, this is the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And so he takes this stone and he sets up a pillar and he takes this vow. And notice he doesn't say, okay, God, you've promised me this, and so you're my God. That's not what he says. He says, if you will take care of me, if I will go back to my father's house in safety, if all these things work out, then you'll be my God. So at this point, he's not saying, okay, the Lord is my God. He's saying, if everything goes well with me and I return back and all this stuff goes well, this stone right here is going to be a pillar that reminds me of my vow. If everything goes well, then the Lord's going to be my God, which is just really, it's really fascinating to me. And he names it the house of God, Bethel. He sets this pillar up, makes that vow. And this dream is showing him, think about where his mind must have been. He's running away from Esau, his brother who wants to kill him. And I mean, he's sleeping with a rock as his pillow. I mean, that can't be super comfortable, right? So there's got to be all kinds of uncertainty. And I mean, he's literally running for his life and just trying to sleep in the middle of running away for your life. That's got to be a little bit rough. And so in the middle of all this uncertainty, God proves that he's in control. He gives him a direct message that I am in control. I'm going to make all of these good things happen to you, that he's above everything and his presence just can't be escaped. I think it's really important. Somebody have a hand up? Yes, sir.
I'm sure you're sure. I'm sure that if God would be with me, I don't know if that's necessarily him saying, well, if God will do this, then I'll do that. I think it could be interpreted where he's just saying something. If God does this for me, I'm with him. Not in the sense of, well, God, if you'll do this, I'll do this. I think it's more of a, he's just establishing it, like almost, if God's done this for me, how could I not? This. That's how I read it.
I got you. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll definitely see some more that his swindling and catching the heels of people days aren't over yet. And when we come back to Bethel, so remember Bethel, because that's going to be a really important city. When he comes back, Jacob's going to be a changed man. And I think in name too, because he's running away from Esau at this point. He's going to come back to Esau at another point. That'll be really a good thing to remember. Okay, anything else on this dream so far? Or on Jacob so far? Okay, so one of the things I want to point out about this dream that Jacob had, there's this big ladder going from the earth to heaven. You see angels ascending from the earth to heaven and descending from heaven. And a lot of times people take that to mean like, okay, God is sending his angels to and from the earth to help the people that he wants to help. And he's in control. In this time of uncertainty, here's Jacob running for his life, using a rock as a pillow, uncertain time. And God is showing him, look, I'm sending my messengers to do my bidding, and I'm in control. And so this dream of this ladder or these steps, your version might say steps, is really a type of the coming seed that has been promised that we've been talking about. It's a type of Jesus. And I really want to show you this. Even though Jacob is separated from his family, he's separated from his land, God's promises to Abraham are still in view as these angels are ascending and descending away from and to the earth. God's looking down. He's overseeing what's happening. And over in John chapter 1, if you remember what happens here, something that Jesus says is really important to what we're talking about. In John chapter 1, and we'll look down at verse 49. John chapter 1, we're going to go down to verse 49. Jesus is still calling his apostles at this point. And so he's called certain people, and Nathanael is one that's called. And Jesus tells him when Nathanael comes up, he's like, look, here's a, I can't remember exactly how he says it. Here's a Hebrew in whom there's no fault in deed, something like that. And Nathanael's like, you know me? You know me? And Jesus says, before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree. And he's like, oh, this is crazy. How did you know about that? And so in John 1, look at verse 49. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Based on what Jesus just did, he was like, how did you know I was under the fig tree? That's crazy. So he says, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. Jesus answered and said to him, verse 50, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. Verse 51, he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Okay. Does that ring any bells to anybody? That's the dream that Jacob just had. And Jesus says, you will see the heavens opened up and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. This is fascinating stuff here. He's alluding back to this ladder or these steps, but Jesus is saying that ladder, those steps is him, right? Because that's what the angels were ascending and descending on. So he's saying, I'm the ladder. I'm the one that these angels go to and fro. Fro, is that a word? Yeah. And so just as this ladder in Jacob's dream is the only way to God's presence. I mean, you see that ladder, and there's this distinction between heaven and earth, and the Lord is in heaven above the ladder, sending the angels up and down. Jesus is saying he's the ladder that those angels ascend and descend to the Father or away from the Father. You gotta go through Jesus to get to the Father. I mean, does that blow anybody's mind here that Jesus is saying that? It's amazing to me. It's wonderful. Okay, any thoughts before we keep going here? Jesus is the mediator. He's the path between God and mankind. And Paul says that in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5 as well. And it's also so amazing that Jesus alludes to this ladder to himself because he is also God. You think about Jesus, not only is he the mediator, but he's also God who's at the top. So that kind of blows my mind as well. But Jesus chose to descend himself in coming to the earth. So cool. And so it was always God's plan to redeem mankind from sin through Jesus, through that seed that we see promised here. And Jesus takes that on himself. Okay, any thoughts on that? Okay. Well, in Genesis 29 through 31, we're just kind of going to scan these really quick because this is where Jacob, he works for a really long time to get Rachel. He doesn't get Rachel right away. He gets Leah. I don't understand some of the stuff that happens here. And then he gets Rachel. He has these 12 sons and one daughter through their maids as well, so their servants. And if you remember the original intent for the family from God's perfect beginning that we talked about weeks ago was one man and one woman for one life. That was God's intent. And we see here that, man has really kind of muddled that up, and it's really kind of been hidden in a lot of things that are happening. There's all kinds of stuff that happened there. Jacob begins to increase beyond Laban, and the Lord just continues to bless Jacob over and over and over again. Yes, sir?
What the story of Rachel and Leah, because the deceptions that Jacob had used to take the place of Esau are all returned against him. He gets Leah instead of Rachel. There's so many images there: the blindness of his father, in this case, the darkness of the tent, the older supplanting the younger, and the younger supplanting the older. All of these images are showing this message that what Jacob had done is being returned to him.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because it changes him too. We see that whole process of dealing with this, and sort of he's being snatched on the heel as he's been snatching people on the heel, and he kind of realizes, man, this is rough. Probably shouldn't be like that anymore. But yeah, absolutely, that stuff comes back onto him. God has blessed Jacob far beyond Laban. Even in all of this stuff, he's been working really hard. Jacob's been blessed by God to increase beyond what he has. And in Genesis 31, look at Genesis 31 and look at verses 11 through 13, please. Genesis 31, we're going to look at verses 11 through 13. And also be thinking about the question that Bob asked earlier, because that's also going to play into some of this that we're going to talk about in a few chapters too. Then, verse 11, the angel of God, okay, this says in Genesis, this is the angel of God, said to me in a dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. He said, lift up now your eyes and see all that the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. So he's been working with Laban. Laban's been snatching him on the heel, tripping him up, deceiving him, and he has just been blessed with all of these flocks and herds, really, that Laban was really mad about. But it says in verse 11, the angel of God said to him in a dream, the angel of God. And the angel of God said in verse 13, I am the God of Bethel. I'm just kind of like looking at people's reactions to see if that affects anybody. The angel of God says, I am the God of Bethel. Okay, that's interesting. I'll just kind of leave that for a second, because sometimes, well, I'll just leave that for a second because we're going to come to some more stuff. The angel of God said, I am the God of Bethel. Okay, and so this angel of God who says, I am the God of Bethel says, okay, it's time to go. it's time to get out of here. It's time to leave and go back to the land of your birth. So that's exactly what Jacob is going to do. And so God tells him to leave. That's what happens. He works 20 years. He had just been working for 20 years for Laban. He's been blessed, extremely prosperous. Laban hears that Jacob is leaving and comes after him, and Laban's not very happy. God appears to Laban in a dream. He says, be careful, don't speak to Jacob good or bad. I honestly don't know how that works either. Like, how can you say anything if you're not going to say good or bad? I don't know. I guess there's just a completely neutral ground that's possible, because that's what he does. And so Jacob realizes that God has made him prosper. Look at Genesis 31 and verse 42, please. Look at verse 42. In verse 42, actually verse 41 and 42. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. So Laban is snatching the heel of Jacob like crazy. Verse 42, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands, so he rendered judgment last night. And this is really big in the life of Jacob, because we don't see Jacob calling on the name of the Lord. We don't really see Jacob giving God any honor. We don't see a lot of that. So for him to say this at this point, after he's done all of this work, after he's labored and been tripped up by Laban, I mean, that's a really big deal. And notice he says, it's the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac was with me. And he says, God has seen my affliction, the toil of my hands, and he rendered judgment last night. So it seems like when Jacob is snatching people's heels and causing people to trip up, and he's running away from Esau, that Jacob is very different from the Jacob we read in Genesis 31, because he's giving God some acknowledgement, and he's saying, okay, this is not just me, because he's the one who rendered judgment last night. And so they make a covenant between them two. They call God as their witness, which I think is also really important. They offer a sacrifice. They cut the covenant together. They eat a meal. And it's going to be really important as we continue that that's sort of a pattern we see with covenants. Cut the covenant. They eat a meal in fellowship together. And so Jacob continues on his journey, and he's going back to the land of his youth. And in Genesis 32, verse 1, now as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him. The angels of God met him. And it says the angels of God met him. So Jacob calls that place 2 camps in verse 2. Jacob said when he saw them, this is God's camp. So he named that place Mahanaim, which means 2 camps. And so it was God's camp and his. And I'm reminded of 2 Kings chapter 6, where the spiritual world is real around us, even if you can't see it. But Jacob was able to see it. And that's why he calls it 2 camps in that place. And we see Jacob has a very visual reminder that God is looking out for him. These angels, I mean, you think about the dream that he had at Bethel, where the angels were ascending and descending on that ladder. He saw God above, and the whole idea was, in this uncertain time, he's running for his life, that God's in control, sending his messengers to do his will, to do his bidding, and he's still in control. And so now he's coming back to the land of his youth. He doesn't know anything about Esau yet, but the last time he saw or heard anything from Esau, he was trying to kill him. So he's going back there. So there might be some feelings of uncertainty and like, oh, I don't know what this is going to be like when I get back. And he sees these angels. And it's just a very visual reminder that, okay, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac is still in control. He's the one who just rendered judgment in this whole thing with Laban, and he's still in control now. Very visual reminder of that. And so let's see. He sends some messengers to his brother Esau, and this is where it gets really interesting, because Esau was trying to kill him 20 years ago. So he sends some messengers to Esau, and look at Genesis 32, verse 6. The messengers returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and furthermore, he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. And so, I mean, if you're Jacob, that's scary. Esau, the dude who was trying to kill you 20 years ago, the whole reason why you left in the first place, he's coming back with 400 dudes with him. Okay, prepare yourself, because it looks like war's coming. Looks like war's coming. But before I keep going, are there any thoughts up to this point? I think I haven't done that in a little bit. Any thoughts up to this point? Okay, so it looks like war is coming from Esau up to this point. And it looks like he's coming to finish the job that he started 20 years ago. And we see Jacob calls on God. He prays to God. It's the first time really that we see this. Look at, look at verse 9. This is the first time that Jacob really explicitly that we read calls on the name of the Lord. And verse 9, Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. I am unworthy of all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he will come and attack me and the mothers with the children. For you said, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered." So we see Jacob acknowledges that God is the one who has made him prosper, that he's the one who has brought him here. He remembers the things that he said to him at Bethel, and he's calling on him here. He's praised that he would deliver him. And he has a plan to approach Esau, and he goes to sleep. He goes to sleep. Let's see. Yeah, so they have this plan where they're going to send out sort of, different companies at a time and this, that, whatever to go see Esau, and they go to sleep. They go to sleep. And actually everybody else crosses the Jabbok River, but Jacob is the only one left back there, and he falls asleep. Okay, any thoughts before we keep going? This is what I've been really excited to get to, by the way. I'm trying not to rush it too much, but I'm really excited to get to this part. Okay, so in Genesis 32, let's just read verses 24 through 32. So Jacob is by himself. He falls asleep. Everybody is away. He's just called on the name of the Lord for the first time. He prays to God to deliver him. And we got to read this. Genesis 32, look at verse 24. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. I mean, what a understatement of a verse. Sometimes it's just a couple of words in the Bible, like when it says, and Jesus was scourged. And there's so much that is involved in that. And here we just read, then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Okay? When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. He said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of his hip. So this is, okay. I mean, this is an interesting thing, is it not? I mean, this is wild. Okay. So we see this account where Jacob wrestles with a man until daybreak. Wrestles with a man until daybreak. And Jacob must have been a really good wrestler. He wrestled with him until daybreak. And it's this man touches the socket of Jacob's thigh and dislocated it. And by the way, I used to wrestle for my school, and I can tell you that wrestling with an injury is not fun. And so if you're injured, most of the time you're not going to win. And especially if you think about Old Testament time period, when you're in a battle, if you're injured, if you fall, it's over for you. It's over. And so if you ever watch boxing and you see them fighting and sometimes they get in a clinch, they kind of just hug onto each other to catch their breath. They don't want to, get punched in the face. So they kind of wrap your arms up and get in a clinch. So Jacob is wrestling until daybreak. But then this man is obviously the superior one because he just touches the socket of his hip and it's dislocated. So now he's injured. And if you're injured in a fight and you fall down in a fight, you're dead. So instead of wrestling back and fighting back with this man, now he's just holding on to him for dear life, because if he falls, he's dead. And so that's why Jacob, he says, let me go, for dawn is breaking, is what this other man said. But Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he needs some assurance that he's not going to be killed if Jacob lets go. He's just holding on to him at this point. He's holding on for dear life. And he has to have some assurance that I'm not going to be killed unless this guy blesses him. So verse 27, he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And this man who he's been wrestling all night, he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Okay, so this is weird. Think about this if you're Jacob. You've been wrestling, you've been struggling, you've been straining, and then this dude just touches your hip socket and it dislocates. That is an obvious sign that this is the superior dude that you're dealing with. Like, that doesn't just happen. I mean, if I'm wrestling with somebody and I just touch his hip socket, that's going to be fine. But Jacob knows there's something different to this. He's injured. He's clinging on for dear life at this point. He says, I'm not letting go unless you bless me. The guy says, okay, what's your name? He says, Jacob, which means one who snatches the heel, right? Someone who trips people up, a deceiver. And he says, your name is no longer going to be Jacob, but it's Israel, because you've striven with God and with men and you've prevailed. So if you're Jacob, you've just been touched on the hip and it was dislocated after wrestling all night. You know this isn't just some normal person. And then this guy says, you've striven with God and with man and have prevailed. Do you think you'd have any questions? I think I would have a lot of questions. And Jacob has a lot of questions. Look at what he asked him. Jacob asked him, verse 29, please tell me your name. Why do you think Jacob wants to know what his name is? He knows this isn't just some ordinary dude. And this person says, why is it that you asked my name? So, this is just a weird situation, is it not? This is crazy. He says, what's your name? You've striven with God and man and have prevailed. He touched him on the hip socket and it dislocates. No man can do that. And so he says, what's your name? He says, why is it that you ask my name? Which, by the way, we'll see that same phrase asked about the same person in many chapters later. I'd love to bring it up, but I don't want to do that right now. So he blessed him there. So Jacob names the place Peniel or Penuel because he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. The sun rose up on him just as he crossed over Penuel. And notice this too. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a vision, because in verse 31, he was limping on his thigh. It's not a vision. It's not a dream, because he has this physical reminder of what just happened. He's limping on his thigh. And he names the place Peniel because he had seen he'd seen God face to face, and yet his life had been preserved. So, I mean, who is this guy? Who is this guy? Any thoughts or anything before we dig into this a little bit? Some will take it to be Christ. Yeah. A pre-incarnate, what was that? Yeah, son. That's a great way to say it. A pre-incarnate son. Yeah. Anybody have any passages that we could turn to, possibly, just to answer some questions on this? Okay, let's look over at Hosea. Look over at Hosea chapter 12, please. Hosea chapter 12. And in Hosea chapter 12, we're going to read verses 2 through 5. 2 through 5. Hosea 12, let's look at verses 2 through 5. And just so you know, that the context here is that if Israel will return, like the nation of Israel will return to God, then God will return to them and will bless them. And in all of this, in verse 2, look at what Hosea has to say here. The Lord also had a dispute with Judah and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. In the womb, he took his brother by the heel. His brother by the heel, Jacob, that's his name. His brother by the heel. And in his maturity, he contended with God. Yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He found him at Bethel, and there he spoke with us. Even the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his name. And then in the context, therefore, return to your God, observe kindness and justice, and wait for your God continually. So as we look at this, what do we see here is described back in Genesis 32? What do we see in Hosea that is described back there? In verse 3, in the womb, he took his brother by his heel, and in his maturity, he contended with God. He contended with God. Verse 4, we see it says, yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed. So here's this person who is called God and who is called the angel. And look at this. He found him at Bethel, verse 4, and there he spoke with us. And who was it that Jacob spoke with? In verse 5, even the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his name. What do we think about that? In describing this event and this man that Jacob wrestled with, we see he's described as God. He's described as the angel. Jacob prevailed and found him at Bethel. And his name is the Lord, the God of hosts. The Lord is his name. So it really seems to me, from what we just read here and over there, that Jacob wrestled with God in the form of a man. I mean, are there any thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
Does this also tie directly to this? For chapter 31, verse 11, when he says, "Then the angel of God," not that one. Sorry. It was in chapter 31 when he says, "God," or an angel appears to him when he says, "I'm God."
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? The angel of God appeared to him and then says, I am God. Okay. We have seen where an angel says, I am God, speaks as an angel. Not every angel speaks as God. That's a really important thing to make sure that we know that. Not every angel speaks and says, I'm God. We actually see angels, like at the end of Revelation, where John bows down to an angel and starts to worship him. And the angel says, hey, I'm a servant just like you are. Don't worship me. But we're going to see other times throughout the Old Testament where there's an angel, a lot of times it's called the angel of the Lord, who says things like, I am God. I am the God at Bethel. And then will accept worship from people. I mean, what do we think about that? Yes, sir?
So it's back in Abraham, the angels came to Abraham, and then one of them stayed behind.
Yeah.
And said, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we will continue to see this. Now, it's not necessarily in our purview of this class to notice every time, but I'm going to try to bring them out because I think it's really important. Because here's God in the form of a man. And if I say God in the form of a man, who does that immediately make you think of? I mean, it makes you think of Jesus. Now, was not called Jesus at this point, but what was the one who we know as Jesus now? Was he alive before he was born on earth? Absolutely. We talked about in our very first class that before anything was created, before time began, before the earth was ever created, the solution was always Jesus. We talk about in the book of Colossians, oh man, why now? No, we can talk about in the book of Colossians where everything was created through him and by him and for him. And so one of the things that the scriptures absolutely teach is that the Trinity, that we talk about the Trinity, is God, is present outside of our timeline all the time. And I'm not in the business of limiting God in any form or fashion at all. And here we see, I really encourage you as you do your daily Bible reads or you read through the Old Testament, notice when the angel of the Lord, usually the angel of the Lord is the phrase, not every time, but if you see the angel of the Lord and then they say, I am God, or they speak as God. So for example, we didn't read this, we scanned it. When God talks to Hagar in the wilderness, she didn't want to see her son die. I encourage you, look this up, like maybe in between this and our worship service. Go and look at what it says and who it says spoke to Hagar. Because it'll say the angel of the Lord and then speaks as the Lord. Okay, I'll leave it to you. Yes, sir. Yeah.
That's not big. It's you beat God. So it's something. Is it? I mean, is it like I wrestle with my kid and I say, "Oh, you beat me"? I mean, because in the same struggle, you have the power to just tap on.
Yeah.
And make that body part no longer function.
Yeah.
So I mean, and it's said in Hosea 2, you won.
Yeah.
You were victorious.
Yeah.
Obviously, God would not
right. I love that. So
That's even saying.
yes, thank you for bringing that. That's exactly where I wanted to go next. And I'm so scatterbrained, I wasn't going to get there. Thank you so much. Notice how it is that Jacob won. Did he win by the actual wrestling and fighting back? When did he win? Enduring, yes, but how did he even endure? He wasn't fighting back at this point. He was clinging for dear life. He was holding on to this man who's God for dear life, and he said, I am not letting go unless you bless me. He's giving himself up. Yes. He's giving himself up. And then God, who came in the form of man, blessed him. And that's how Jacob won. Not by fighting and contending against him. Yes, he was contending, but it wasn't until he was holding on for dear life and submitted himself and said, I am not letting go unless you bless me. Oh, there's a sermon in that, is there not? That's great stuff. If you want, look back at Genesis 16. That's where God talks to Hagar in the wilderness. And notice who it says it is and how it says it is. All right, thank you all.